serpent would bruise the seed of the woman in the heel, and the seed of the woman would bruise the serpent in the head, meaning the bruising in the heel would be a temporary death, whereas the bruising in the head would be complete death, right? Complete destruction. So that's the setup, if you like, for the outplaying of that whole thing that happened on Mount Sinai and the Mosaic Law. And so it's like the background and the setting for the Mosaic Law was setting up for the sacrificial thing, this whole idea of that you now had to sacrifice for salvation. That in turn came from the Passover that occurred in Egypt when they were released from Egypt, and the so-called angel of death came and killed all the firstborn of the Egyptians, but passed over the households that had placed the blood on their doorways, so that they were showing that they were aligning themselves to this new salvation. So, we then have the Mosaic Law, the Ten Commandments, and all the regulations that came underneath that. But the bottom line of it all was that it was to carry out sacrifices with the view that it would eventually lead to a final sacrifice that would sort it all out for all times. That's the bruising in the heel, the Messiah. And so, that's the whole scene in the idea of Genesis and then the Mosaic Law leading up to something that would bring that all to an end and ultimate freedom. So
So the Mosaic law is really rigid and stale, you could say.
well, so the way I'd express it is that it's law.
Mm.
And the difficulty of law is that it is fixed, right? Written,
Right,
fixed.
right.
And the symbol was quite apt and appropriate because it was written in stone, right? The
True.
stone tablets. So in that sense, it was hard coded, hard rock, right? There was no room for movement. Okay. So it was good for setting the framework for your living and your life. And, here's the rules, stick with them, break the rules, and you're out. Right? So law and regulations are very, very good for that. And it's very similar to the idea of the scaffolding or the guardrails that hold you within a particular structure, seemingly for your protection, but also for structure, right? Structure. But, it was stated very clearly that a time would come when the law would no longer be written on stone, coming to your point, right? That the law would be written on the heart. That's the law of love, right? So the prophets made it very clear that a time was coming when that would then be the regime, the way of going forward. And the point about um, the law being written on the heart is that it becomes malleable, right? Soft, not hard. And it can adjust, right? And so you get a stronger sense of this idea of real justice, right? You often hear the idea that the law is a fool, right? Because when you have the rule, and the only question is, did you obey the rule or did you not obey the rule? And if you didn't obey the rule, then that was it. You're dead, right? And the classic example and illustration of that whole point was the one that was given by Jesus.
Ah,
Sorry about that.
you
But,
ascended. I thought you were like just ascended off.
um, what I was talking about there was the prophets were referring to a time when the
Yes. Yep.
law would be written on the heart. And the advantage of, or the difference of that is it's not hard coded. Um, Law that's written on the heart is malleable. And so you get this whole different idea, not just of the law, but of the intended justice. So the idea of justice being able to change the outcome despite someone having broken the law, right? That's the implication of the law being written on the heart. In other words, it can bend, can change. So the perfect example of or illustration of how that worked was the case where Jesus was sitting in the temple in the court of the Gentiles, and a woman had been brought into the court, and she was facing the judges in the court, and she'd been accused of adultery. And the judges turned around to Jesus and said, "What do you think?" Their reason for this was because they knew that he was a little bit soft, right? And they were hoping that he was going to end up condemning himself by saying, "Oh no, the law didn't apply," or something like that, to give them some sort of leverage against them. But he basically doesn't go there at all. He doesn't say, the law doesn't apply. Instead, he turns around to them and looks straight at the judges and says, um, whoever of you is without sin, let you be the one to cast the first stone, right? Talking about adultery. Now you have to remember that he had already had a session with these ones about adultery and the meaning of adultery and the fact that they were all divorcing their wives, relying on the certificate of divorce that Moses supposedly had provided to allow them to divorce their wives. And he had stated the situation really, really clearly. He said, a man and a woman brought together and, to become one flesh. The only reason why you're able to divorce and break that arrangement is because you rely on the certificate of Moses. I'm telling you that that certificate isn't really valid if you go back to the original intention of marriage, so that anyone who divorces his wife like that will cause her to be a subject of adultery if she has to remarry. You too. So, in other words, he was saying they were all adulterers. And if that was the case, they were liable to be stoned themselves. So that was the power of him saying to them, well, okay, you think she's guilty, that you who is without sin pick up that first stone and throw it. And the result was they all put down their stones and walked off. And then, and then he says to them, well, what happened? And, did they condemn you? And she says, no, they all left and they didn't condemn me. And here's the punchline. So Jesus says, well, if they didn't condemn you, neither do I. So very cleverly, he brought in that idea of the law of in the heart and the justice of the situation. So while she may technically have breached the law, doesn't say whether she did or didn't, but while she may technically have done that, basically she was off the hook. So therein lies the lesson of the law of love. The Mosaic law was actually putting you on the hook. You're a sinner. You're on the hook. You are now liable to death. You have to appease. You have to do these sacrifices. The law of love did the opposite, got you off the hook, says basically you're innocent, right? You believe you're a sinner, but I'm telling you from the beginning, you are innocent and you are off the hook. And I'm going to have to do this thing to actually show it for you, right? So then we see this sacrifice, the bruising and the heel, that was referenced way back in the Garden of Eden, kick in, and him, Jesus, go through that process of neutralizing that event and saying, well, the truth of this matter is you are not sinners. And I'm going to go through this process where what has been asked of that seed right back in the Garden of Eden was to perform a sacrifice for the appeasement and the atonement. So this raises another issue about what Jesus did. Most people focus on the sacrifice component or element. Most people focus on the dying bit for paying for the sins, like debt. Really, there was no debt, but it was to show that the debt was the seeming debt was being paid for the purpose of, so coming back to purpose, for the purpose of seeming redemption. The idea that if there was a debt, as per the idea of sin, then this was the undoing of that in the form of a redemption. Looking deeper into that idea, that wasn't actually the purpose, right? It was kind of walking into the narrative that had been created, the narrative of sin. So it was walking into that the same way we walk into the fear that comes up. We have to walk into it and face it and release it. So it's that same idea, the redemption. The real purpose, and it is also shown in the actual Passover ceremony. The real purpose was atonement. That's the bit that doesn't seem to get the focus. It's more the idea of you're a sinner and you require redemption. Here's the redemption, and that's the value of Jesus, right? Um, in the actual ceremony, the blood of the goat or the bull was sprinkled in the most holy for the purpose of atonement. That's what it was ultimately for. And so that's really what the purpose of Jesus' seeming sacrifice was for, atonement. And as you know, and I know, atonement is at one-ment. So, if you think of it in terms of innocence, it's the restoration of the innocence to bring you back into a state of being at one with the Father. Okay? That is why the law was brought to an end, because it was paid and atoned. All mankind who seemingly had been dropped into the state of being sinful had been atoned and positioned so that they were now innocent and could see themselves as innocent and could see themselves as being restored to at one-ment, right? And so the only thing that was needed then was just to remember that. Hence the memorial, or the taking of the symbols to keep remembering. Oh yeah, okay, that's what that was all about. It was for my atonement. Right? It didn't have to be, something that was turned into a slavish thing, right?
Ritualistic.
Ritual was useful to keep remembering that, but the thing was to remember the atonement bit, right? The redemption bit was just the mechanism to get you to the atonement bit. That makes sense?
Yeah.
So that's why, the law was brought to an end. And so there were two ways of looking at, like, um, Jesus was saying, I didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. Okay, fine. He fulfilled it. And from that perspective, he brought it to an end. Many people still say, well, because he didn't come to destroy it, it still applies, right?
Yeah, and we see that a lot today with, for one example, pork, not eating pork. When Jesus specifically said that it's not what goes into your mouth that defiles, but what proceeds forth from the heart.
Absolutely. See, and so we have that, and then we have the actually, this is a great segue into the next bit, which is again totally relevant. So we have Jesus saying that really, really clearly, right? Absolutely clearly. So dietary considerations, not a thing, right? Which again implied that the law against eating pork was at an end. Then we have the actual specific example of it and the resistance to that with Peter,
Yes.
right? So Peter,
Because
bless
Peter
him,
was really hard-headed.
yeah, bless him. Peter was really struggled with fear of man. Right? That became pretty obvious from his actions. He got there. He eventually got there. And, he made it to Rome. But Peter was very fearful, and that was shown when he ended up denying Jesus 3 times, right? After specifically saying, "I will never abandon you." When the chips went down, he just, he lost it. He just lost it. Became really fearful. Then he obviously he was starting to feel the spirit. He started to get it. And so he started to interact with the Gentiles the way that Jesus had told them to interact with the Gentiles. He was saying, well, you need to go out and start talking to them now, right? Whereas the law had said, oh, it was unclean. You couldn't go into the house of a Gentile, right? And let alone eat with them. So Peter had started to do that. But then the the ones so there was a bunch of or group in Jerusalem that were holding the fort, so to speak, and preaching Jesus' words. But because they were in Jerusalem, they were still surrounded by the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the system, right, which had just executed their boss, right? So they had become quite circumspect, literally circumspect in how they carried out their ministry. And so they started to pull back a bit when it came to talking to the Jews, the Israelites. They were so fearful of the Pharisees and the leadership at the synagogues, bearing in mind that if you got kicked out of the synagogue, right, for being a follower of that heretic guy, Jesus, you lost your whole network. You lost your means of living. You lost everything. So, that was like a really big fear-inducing disincentive to go 100% full on and say, well, the law's ended, guys. You can imagine if that's what they said. The law's ended. You're no longer bound by the law. You can eat pork, and you don't have to follow these rules.
Because this requires like a total shift in mind. It's like going to a different country and then just
Totally.
everything being totally new.
Bearing in mind their whole lives, for all their lives, they had been mind trained, mind numbed into that way of thinking. And now Jesus has come along and just went whack, right? Now we're changing things, right? So, I call that change management. They had to go through this change management process, whereas now they're having to let go of all that way of thinking. And that's what Jesus' conversations were all about, right? Letting that go. So James, his half brother, and a number of others um, were there in Jerusalem, and they were thought of as the elders for the congregation at Jerusalem. And so Peter, when he heard that James and those other ones were coming to see him, he freaked out, and he basically reverted back to his, oh, I'm actually a Jew, and I follow the law type thing. And he stopped associating with the Gentiles. he still passed on the message, but he stopped going into the houses, that type of thing, right? So
Mhm.
pulled back. And yeah, he still held to the Jewish requirement, the Mosaic requirement to dietary laws, including not eating anything unclean, which included pork. So much so that an angel actually had to come and say to him, look, all that's over. You need to now change and hear. So he had a vision of a covered tablecloth, I can't remember, covered in all these foods, including these unclean foods. And it came down and he was told to eat. And he refused. Yeah,
Yeah.
he refused. He says, "Oh, I could never do, such a thing." 3 times, like the denial.
Lucky
Three
number.
times. 3 times he did it, and I can't remember if there was an account of where he actually went, "Oh yeah, okay," and then partook. I can't remember whether he did or didn't, but bottom line was he refused 3 times at least, right? Um, but he must have, because he eventually started associating with the Gentiles and eating with them. So, you know, I think I've forgotten, to be honest. I think he got there, and that is when James and his followers came in, and then he reverted. Right, he became very fearful, to the extent that Paul had to come and talk to him and tell him, hey, stop being stop being a weirdo,
Stubborn.
you know? And then there was this meeting that was held in Jerusalem where these issues that were obviously floating around at the time had to be dealt with. And the question was, what are we going to tell the Jews that were converting to the followings of Jesus, and what are we going to tell the Gentiles? Because there are many that were in I've forgotten the name of the congregation, um, where Paul was, that was saying you still need to get circumcised, right? So it came up, and um, basically they were Jews who had converted to Jesus' teaching, but were still dragging the law along with them. And they were saying, hey, you need to get circumcised. You still need to do these things, right? So the issue was then taken back to Jerusalem, and a meeting, and it was only a one-time meeting. This was not a continuous meeting. It was just one time. They sat down and they had a discussion about it. And um, that was the opportunity for them to say, well, you know, the law's at an end, and we now need to open up and not be concerned about circumcision, eating foods, and blah blah. Right? That didn't happen. Peter didn't even tell them about what happened with the vision about the food coming down. He didn't say anything about that. He just kept quiet, although he kind of went along with what they were saying. And one of the concessions that they made was, um, the Gentiles were not required to be circumcised, right? So the Gentile converts that were converting to followers of Jesus did not have to get circumcised. The unsaid bit seemed to be, however, if you were Jewish, you had to get circumcised, right? So it was still a little bit fuzzy about circumcision, but essentially they said, well, circumcision no longer required, and definitely not required of the of the Gentiles. However, blood, partaking of blood, still applies. Paul clearly did not agree with that, right? And they, from memory, they also felt that the ministry needed to be to the Jews first. Paul disagreed. The reason why I mention this is because they had developed this idea that that group in Jerusalem was somehow some sort of central deciding body, like the Vatican, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And that all decisions were being made for all of the Christians from that point. Whereas the reality was there was only one meeting and only one decision, set of decisions made. And when you think it through, those decisions were made out of fear and were made out of fear and still were trying to keep the law in place. Admittedly, it might only have been for the Jews themselves, but they were still trying to hold the law in place. Versus a process of change management, if you want to think of it like that, where where the brothers were saying, well, look, all our lives we've been brought up this way about the law. And Jesus has now made it pretty clear that this is at an end. However, because our consciences are so weak in relation to that, it's very difficult for many to make the jump 100%, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to shift it through slowly. And for those Jews that are still stuck in that kind of mindset, okay, just be aware that the law is brought to an end. You're not bound by it. But if you want to continue in those practices, that's up to you. That's what should have been said, right? It's not what was said, that is what should have been said, in my opinion. Change management, right? Which then left Paul free, and this is exactly what he did, to go out to the Gentiles and preach 100% unrestricted version, right, from the law. So, if so this was another one that they had talked about at that Jerusalem meeting. Meat sacrificed to idols, right? So they were still having trouble with that one. So, if meat had been sacrificed to an idol and then it was put in the market, because that's what happened, it would get sold in the marketplace, and you would come along and you'd say, was this being offered up to false gods? And if they say, yeah, um, those ones with those weak consciences would go, oh no, I can't eat that. Right? So still very stuck with the law. Paul goes, hey, not a problem. Eat it. It's okay. Coming back to Jesus' words, it's not what goes into your mouth that defiles a man, right? So Paul totally got it, totally, fully understood. We are now in a shift, right? We've shifted from that one over there to this one over here. You're not bound by that. That was a much easier message to speak to the Gentiles because they weren't in that system. So, all fine for them. Much harder when it came to the the Jews who had been used to living under the Jewish system. However, the message was still the same. It's not what goes into your mouth that defiles a man, but what comes out, right? And that's what prompted Paul, particularly, to go forward with that message that the law was nailed to the cross, brought to an end.
And that makes a lot of the Old Testament, like, I don't even know the words for it, like, not needed going forward because we're under the law of love.
So it's like there's a whole new constitution put into place, right? We had that legal system, that whole regime up until this point. That system has now been, I wouldn't quite use the word invalidated, right? You could say it's now invalid. It has an end date. Like a law is passed and it is it applies up to a certain date.
Yeah.
That's how I describe it. From this date onward, that law no longer applies. It's completed and it's done its job. Its job was to be like a scaffolding to raise and to protect the people up to a point. But then the point comes when it's all done, it's finished, it's complete. The church, the people, which is the church, has been restored. Now we can take the scaffolding down, right? So that's as we've expressed in the past, when we looked outside the apartment and saw the church surrounded by scaffolding, that's how you can see the law. Its purpose was to allow the church, the body, to be renovated. Another way of thinking of it is renewed, the recreation, right? The recreation, once it's in place, doesn't need the scaffolding anymore. So that's another reason you can say the law was fulfilled, is not needed anymore, and it's replaced by a new law. Only two. Love God with your whole heart, your whole soul, your whole strength. Love your brother as yourself. That's it. You can wrap all of the 10 commandments and everything else into those two things. And that brings you back to the law of love.
And we,
Because
we can also say that the new covenant is the Christ revealed within.
it's its purpose, right? Why you can say it's the law of love is because that first commandment, love God with your whole heart, your whole strength, and your whole soul. If God is love, then that's what you do. Love with your whole
Yeah.
heart, your whole soul, and your whole strength. And if you're going to love your brother as yourself, same deal. Love, the law of love. And that's why in the scriptures it says there is no law against love. You can't legislate against it, which is why it is so flexible and malleable and appropriate for any given circumstance, because you might have a law, a literal law in place, but when you apply the law of love over the top of that, that's the one that wins, as per the example that Jesus gave with the adulteress.
Yes,
There
that's a
you go.
great point. That's a great point. And to end this off, would you like to quickly talk about how that applies to Revelation? That because that's, needs a bit of a reinterpretation, but because there's this big, if we're under the law of love, how does Jesus come back to kill everyone?
So perfect point. Perfect point, brother. Oh, that's such a big one. But I'll try and chunk it down into 6 minutes. So there are so many elements in the book of Revelation that really don't seem to fit Jesus' message, right? And you put your finger on the pulse in terms of all the blood and the destruction, right? That really doesn't look like the message that Jesus was giving, the law of love. So it's my version of it that it isn't Jesus' message, as is clearly indicated by the content, right? When you look at the content and you examine it and you go through it, you go, holy shit, this is nothing like Jesus' message of love, right? It's about a punishing God.
We're going back to the Old Testament way of thinking.
So it's almost like there has been a book that's been plonked into the New Testament that takes you back to the law and the restoration of the temple arrangement. Right? And as you know, the when the temple and when Jesus was killed, the curtain in the temple was torn, ripped
Yep.
asunder,
Yep.
and the doors were open. Right? That was the indicator that that temple was now no longer the place for offering sacrifice. It was not possible to offer sacrifice there. The place for offering sacrifice was the Christ, right? And the kingdom of the Christ was within. So Jesus was the symbol for that. And the symbol was
In.
the kingdom is within, which is exactly what he said. Kingdom is within. That is the new place, if you like. It was always the place, but it was the new place for the holding of the altar. So that's why we carry out the practices that keep that altar cleansed and clean and pristine, which is the mind, so that we can put out whatever sacrifices that we have to offer in there. That's the place for doing it. No longer a physical place for doing it. So what you get to see is that, our friends standing behind you, arms open, right, is the symbol of the altar within. the Christ. Right? That's where it is, which is why the temple, the physical temple curtain was ripped, and why Jesus said the when he was pointing to the the temple, answering the question that had been asked. So this is Matthew 24. His disciples came and asked him, what is the sign of the end of the system of things? And he starts off by saying a number of things, and that the temple, no stone would be left standing. Right. So basically, he's saying end of the temple. Right. Jerusalem is about restoration of the temple. Right. And the restoration of the 12 tribes. Right? Whereas that had been all brought to an end, and everything was opened up to more than the 12 tribes. So that's why I sort of look at the book of Revelation now and I go, okay, it doesn't seem like
Mhm.
Jesus' message of love. So, yep, there we go. 6 minutes.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much for putting 3 hours worth of content in 1 hour.
Yeah, there's so much more in there that would need to be unpacked, and like some of it's a little bit hazy in the back of my mind, and you could finesse some of the detail, but
That's
the
great because if people want to go more into it with you, then
yeah,
I'll put Will's information in the description, and they can contact you to go more deeper into it in a one-on-one or in another talk.
perfect. The last comment I'd like to make is that while the book of Revelation is stated to be from the Apostle John,
Mm,
I would like to say I think the correct book that should have been there and that people should be reading is the Gnostic text known as the Apocryphon of John.
mhm.
When you read through that, it gives you a completely different feel for what was being said by John versus what was said in the book of Revelation. So I think that's a worthwhile read.